Hi there. This discourse is on the spiritual attribute of creation. Well, one of the obvious things to think of when we say creation is everything. The universe and everything in it. We refer to that as creation, all of creation. And certainly as a spiritual attribute, it is connected to the everything, the all that is. But it also has a more practical use for us. Think of creative energies and forces. All the creative energies and forces within the universe. Now, the average person wouldn't know what all they are, and scientists know a lot more and are still discovering. And in a way, those scientists who work with the forces of the universe, the creative forces of the universe, or any of the forces really, because in a way they are all the creative forces of the universe, because they are part of creation, and without all of them, there would be no physical universe. Our scientists at this point, except at the quantum level, they're starting to, don't work with the spiritual energies as such, spiritual creative forces, but maybe one day they will. Maybe that's where we're heading, humanity. We could well be heading to that. But at this point, when we look at it, and we often think that spirituality is on one hand and science is way over on the other, well, there's not that big a gap. They're coming more and more closer together again now. They started off one and the same at the very beginning. Mankind has pushed them apart, but we needed to, in order to be able to understand the physical world we live in. We had to separate it from the spiritual over time. But now it's time to bring it back together again and making them one. And that in itself is a creative force at work. And creative forces sometimes divide, and sometimes they unite. And sometimes there's a cycle to this. Sometimes there has to be destruction before there can be something new created. So with our use as spiritual people of the spiritual attribute of creation, it is becoming aware that we as human beings are creators. Even non-spiritual people are creators. We create stuff as we go. We create emotional fog or energy that emanates from us, mental energy that emanates from us. We create physically by procreating, but we also invent things. We change our environment. Where artists paint, musicians or composers compose. People who act on the stage, they're creating roles, they create characters and act them out. We are immersed in creation. We really are. If we think about it, it is everywhere. The energy of creation is all around us. And we, as human beings, harness it often unconsciously, and therefore some of our creations are really awful, deadly, destructive, horrible. The more consciously we create, then we have the opportunity to start to make beautiful creations, useful creations, creations that don't harm, creations that heal. So, you know, and this is without having to be what you would call a spiritual person. You know, ordinary human beings do this. This is what we've evolved into. When early humankind made the first primitive tools, they created something useful. So it's like we were created to be creators. And I do truly believe that. We were created to be creators. And now as we become more spiritually aware, we need to realise that we have a responsibility to make sure that all our creations are positive, useful, they don't harm. So our very first task as a spiritual person is how we create ourselves, or we could say recreate ourselves. And that's just what we are doing on our path as we are learning and growing and coming to understand more of the laws that govern us and how we can work with them, coming to realise that we live more than one life and work with that concept, how karma works. So many things, I could keep naming them. And we're becoming more aware of them and how we can use them to create more positively in our lives. And as we create more positively in our life, that flows out into the world in general. By our energy is better. Also, we might create things that help people, and we serve as role models to other people on how to create a better life. So that's all part of what we do as spiritual people, and you're already doing that. Okay, you just hadn't connected it with a spiritual attribute called creation. And that's what I'm doing now. I'm just making that connection. We're helping you make that connection now. Because having made that connection gives you even more power to use it wisely. Manifestation, the laws of manifestation are linked to the spiritual attribute of creation. Because manifesting something is creating it. Okay? And a lot of you are working with that as well. So affirmations, we use them to try to create things and make changes, create changes. So if you want to really work with the spiritual attribute of creation more consciously, more intelligently, you need to nurture your imagination. Because it is through our imagination that we make the connection to the creative forces, to the creative energies. It's through our imagination that we link up with ideas and things that we need. It's not working with that alone. As I've said, the spiritual attributes don't work alone. There is another spiritual attribute called spiritual attunement, which we haven't covered yet, but it works very well with creation, particularly when it comes to inventing things. And there are others too. And part of this working with spiritual attributes, once you've been introduced to all 49 of them and have some understanding of them, then it gets very interesting when you start to see how they work together. And then when you start to consciously use them together. Okay? So that knowing them all, consciously working with them all and growing in your understanding of them and how they work and how you can use them vastly accelerates your own growth on the spiritual path. So with looking at creation today, I'm now focusing on your imagination. Now, some people have great imaginations, and that's excellent. But what you have to be careful of is you don't let that imagination get out of hand. Okay? Our imagination is the doorway to other realms. Without that, it's very hard to be able to connect to other realms without our imagination. But we run the risk of creating other realms, but they're not real. We're just creating the illusion of it for ourselves. So an overactive active imagination can actually take us into realms of fantasy, which might be very interesting and pleasant, and they're wonderful places to be in meditation if you know that they are fantasy and it's just there to help you to relax, or maybe to point out certain spiritual principles to you so that you can understand them. But that some of these things that you see and experience are actually not part of creation in all its dimensions. So you have to be aware of that, keeping your imagination on track. And if you haven't got much of an imagination, then that's where you need to start to work. Because all of these spiritual attributes are words of power, they can be invoked. You can evoke the spiritual attribute of creation specifically to create more fertility, for want of a better word, but we talk about fertile imagination, so I'll use that word, to create a more fertile imagination. Everyone has one, I think, the majority of people. Certainly I would expect the people listening to this would all have an imagination of some kind. So if you feel your imagination is lacking, then invoke the spiritual attribute of creation for the purpose of creating a more active, a more fertile, a more creative imagination. And that may then help you to be able to experience more if somebody takes you on a guided meditation, because a more creative imagination may help you to visualize the things or to sense the things that you're supposed to do to get you into that state where you can receive the guidance and insights that you need. Now, you can, even if I don't have much of an imagination, I can't draw, I can't paint, I can't draw. Look, that doesn't matter. You can finger paint if that's all it is, or if you don't want to get your fingers dirty, just get some cheap paint and cheap brushes and cheap paper and just doodle. Get colours, because colours have their value as well. If anyone is into colour therapy, you'll know how the importance of colour. Colour is very important on our mood and our mental state as well. But yeah, you're not creating anything that you're going to get somebody to buy from you or something like that, but you want to stimulate your creative imagination. So if you've got paints and paper and brushes, and so you just randomly start going and plonking stuff on, and whether it's daubs and slashes, it doesn't matter. That's it. Just get into it and let it be whatever. And you'll find that if you don't think too hard on it, your imagination will wake up and it will start to produce something that you realise, that looks quite nice. And some of it may even have symbolic meaning to you. So it's actually a good way of sometimes getting some information and getting about yourself and getting some messages. Because you'll find you've drawn some symbols, or you've painted some symbols, or there's something in there that just speaks to you. So yeah, and you don't have to spend a lot of time doing it, you know, half an hour every day or so, or 15 minutes a day. It depends on whether you're somebody that likes to do a certain amount of something at this time every day, or whether you like to be more spontaneous about it. You have to do these things in a way that suits your personality. Otherwise you won't do it. It'll be too much of a chore and you won't do it. But I do suggest that, working on that imagination is going to help you to be able to wisely use the spiritual attribute of creation. If you already have that good imagination, using it to create things in your life, either artistically or in other ways, is going to help you to master the spiritual attribute of creation. So I'll leave you with that. It's a really lovely attribute. It has lovely energy with it, which you may have noticed that I seem to have tuned into. Thank you very much for listening to me.